Joe Biden has blasted China. U.S. President Joe Biden has blasted China. This comes on the heels of many so-called diplomatic visits that I've called fake diplomacy, in which the U.S. has sent out climate envoy John Kerry, Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen, Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and on and on and on. They've gone to China over the last several months. It's been kind of a summer of meetings, and each and every one of them has produced very little results, very few results. And that was all by design. In my opinion, these visits were nothing but a show. And almost each and every time these visits occurred, there was an escalation in warmongering rhetoric and policy, in particular, the economic war on China. When I was in China, Janet Yellen came to visit about a day or two after I left Beijing in early July. And before she came, there was a travel warning to Americans saying, you might get arrested by China without any cause or purpose. And so you need to be warned not to travel there. When Antony Blinken came, Joe Biden, directly after the visit, this less than 24 hours, told a fundraiser with a bunch of oligarchs and told them that Xi Jinping was a dictator. And this caused a stir and consternation, and of course, rejection and repudiation on the part of China. Well, Joe Biden is at it again. And this is really something else. Okay, this is really something else. Joe Biden said that China is run by bad folks. The U.S. president has also reportedly told political donors that the Chinese economy is a ticking time bomb. So before I get into this article, though, I want to, because it's going to review a lot of what was said, here's what Bloomberg reported on this development in a very interesting way, okay? Basically rejecting what Joe Biden had to say. And I think this shows a conflict among the neocons, of course, and the corporate elites, the oligarchy on China, because these comments were very just off base. They didn't make any sense, and there was a lot of misinformation within them. So it wasn't just ideology. It wasn't just calling Xi Jinping a dictator. But Mr. Joe Biden, the president of the United States, basically was pushing lies. And so I want to show you what Bloomberg had to say about this, okay? Here is the report from Bloomberg.
Adding insult to injury, calling China a ticking time bomb, and adding, quote, that's not good, because when bad folks have problems, they do bad things. Let's get to team coverage now with Bloomberg's Katie Lyons and Tom Orlik out of Washington. Katie, what did the president mean by that?
Well, he was essentially poking at China's economy, John, but in doing so, he also said a few things that are just simply factually inaccurate. He was talking about how they have a higher number of people of retirement age than working age. That statement not only is untrue, it's off by hundreds of millions of people. He also said China has gone from growing 8% a year to 2%. China grew 5.5% in the first half. So he was saying some things that were untrue, but definitely sharp criticism of China's economy at a time in which the economic conversation around China for Beijing is likely highly sensitive. I know Tom will run through.
So she just said what he said was untrue. the counterfactual, hey, China actually does not have this huge retirement age population. It's not suffering in that way. And the fact that the Chinese economy is a ticking time bomb, the growth numbers are completely wrong. He said that China's economy is only growing at about 2%. That is exactly the number that the United States is currently growing at, around 2%. I believe last quarter it was 2.2%. So this is just total projection, but it's not being, I don't think it's being done purposefully, because you don't pull numbers out like that on purpose. You're not, that would just be making a fool out of yourself, and that's what Biden is doing. But I don't think that was purposeful. The reality is that China is growing closer to 5% at the moment and has gone up as high as 8% in 2021. But let's continue.
through more on what is going on in the economy and some of the fragilities of it, but it could be poking the bear a little bit here, especially at a time in which President Biden and his administration are trying to stabilize ties with Beijing. We have seen something like this happen before, John. If you recall back in June, also at a donor event, Biden referred to Chinese President Xi Jinping as a dictator in the almost immediate aftermath of Secretary of State Antony Blinken returning from a trip to Beijing, attempting to normalize relations. Of course, since then, we have seen other officials traveling to Beijing. U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen made a trip, as did climate envoy John Kerry. We're expecting Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo to do the same. But this still could be disruptive in this relationship and could make it more difficult, perhaps, the proposition for President Biden to meet in person with Xi Jinping this fall, considering not only he is making remarks like a ticking time bomb, but also the U.S. is taking active action to restrict China's advancement of certain technologies.
So that's true. This is all true. And so that's a very truthful report. Indeed, not only is Joe Biden making these kind of remarks which soil and essentially destroy any kind of diplomatic efforts that I believe were always fake. And maybe there was a kernel of, what's the word, genuine sort of feelings about keeping U.S. investment in China and U.S. trade with China relatively stable. Maybe there was a kernel of genuine desire to keep that stable. But the fact is that all of the policy moves by the Biden administration are saying and doing the exact opposite. So that's what we're going to get into. But before we get into how at the same time that Biden is making these absolutely afactual, lie-riddled remarks about China, the Biden administration is escalating an economic war on China. And all of it is in the lead up to a supposed fall visit that Joe Biden is supposed to make to China to meet with Xi Jinping directly. This is something that was promised all the way back during the G20 summit. And that promise to keep relations stable has not been kept by the United States. And so now Joe Biden said that, and it was worse than this, the ticking time bomb, China is run by bad folks. Okay. And I want to just read you what he said, because I think she did an okay job, the Bloomberg reporter, but I think the summary helps give you even a better picture. So at this Park City, Utah fundraiser, so this was in front of oligarchs, Biden said that Xi Jinping's government was in trouble because economic problems were a ticking time bomb. They got some problems. That's not because we had, that's not good, because when bad folks have problems, they do bad things. So there's a latent kind of threat there. Oh, let me, it's a little too small. So that's not good, because when bad folks have problems, they do bad things. And then he called the Belt and Road Initiative a debt in noose, alluding to China's loans on developing countries. So it was even worse than what the reporter said. So I just wanted to clarify that. But now I want to talk to you about this investment ban, because it's the next step in this economic war on China led by the United States. And it is it's beginning to mirror what the United States has been doing with Russia. But the fact is that unlike Russia, China is not just a competitor, but has actually surpassed the U.S. in many fields technologically. The same can't be said about Russia, despite Russia's resiliency. So the White House unveils a ban on U.S. investment in China's tech sector. And here's what the Financial Times has to say. Financial Times is actually one of my favorite outlets in the mainstream, because it truly does speak to the ruling elite, and they are less likely to lie to the ruling elite in the same manner. So the Biden administration will ban some U.S. investment into China's quantum computing, advanced chips, and artificial intelligence sectors as it boosts efforts to stop the Chinese military from accessing American technology and capital. And now, mind you, This sabotage of diplomacy also goes into this area. Before this investment ban was officially signed off on, Gina Raimondo, the Commerce Secretary, she's supposed to go to China later in August. And this ban, this investment ban was coupled with, and I think supercharged by, accusations that China supposedly hacked into computer systems relating to the relevant departments, the Commerce Department, Treasury. Basically, this whole Mike Pompeo-esque China stealing our economic secrets is being repeated by the Biden administration. So the new executive order unveiled by Biden on Wednesday will come into force next year and will require companies to notify the government of other investments in 3 Chinese sectors. The actions will largely affect private equity and venture capital firms, as well as U.S. investors in joint ventures with Chinese groups. A senior official said it would create very targeted programs that would focus on 3 sectors that the administration has marked out in a series of technology-related measures aimed at China. We want to provide bright line guidance on what is prohibited and separately what is notified. Biden said technological progress in the sectors pose significant national security risks because computers could advance in ways that would help develop sophisticated weapons and break cryptographic codes used by spy agencies to protect data. The order is the latest series of actions designed to limit Chinese access to advanced technology in what U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called a small yard, high fence strategy. So Beijing has countered that these actions are designed to limit technological progress. China's Commerce Ministry on Thursday expressed serious concern about the order, saying it deviates from the principles of fair competition and the market economy that the U.S. supposedly advocates. So last October, there was a G20 summit where there was a promise that this meeting would lead to more stable economic relations and cooperation. And China has consistently asked the United States to stop efforts like this, but they continue to escalate nonetheless. Now, as the economic war escalates, okay, there have been many, many warnings coming from all sides. So there have been warnings from China. There have been warnings from the ruling elite. There have been warnings from the economic oligarchs who are worried about their investments, not just in China, but everywhere, because this will become a supply chain issue. They are worried that this could actually have negative ramifications. Remember, what has sanctions on Russia done? It has actually curtailed and slowed down the global economy. And while some corporations in the military industrial complex and U.S. big oil has run away, there have been huge impacts with inflation, etc. And so we have warnings coming out. And so this isn't necessarily a popular development, okay? For the Financial Times, again, said U.S. investors are preparing for uncertain future after tech ban. After Biden announced a ban on U.S. investment on some of China's key tech industries, the founder of a Shanghai-based semiconductor startup felt forced to react. After the news came out, I was determined to move the team out of China, at least part of the team. Otherwise, the financing will be very limited. The U.S. ban, announced an executive order and due to come into force next year, aims to block investment in quantum computing, advanced chips, and artificial intelligence in an effort to stop China's military from accessing American funding and know-how. For their part, U.S. investors are trying to work out the potential impact of Biden's order on their holdings in China and weighing up strategies to comply or exit. So there you have, that's what's happening. They're seeing the writing on the wall, but there have been already a lot of pulling out of China. A lot of these tech companies are doing that. Buyout groups struck deals in China worth $47 billion in 2021, but they fell rapidly to just $2.4 billion in 2022, $2.8 billion so far this year. So U.S. investors are cooling on China tech deals. So here you have it. Since the start of this economic war, look at the dip here. Look at in semiconductor deals, a huge dip. In AI and machine learning deals, look at that dip, okay, in the last year or so. So this is a problem right now. And there is a bit, that was less of a warning and just a bit of a reality check that there's going to be lost investments. But the warnings have come, okay? And I'm going to first show you The Economist. The Economist is lambasting what the Biden administration is doing with China. And this is not an old article. This is actually within the last few days. Joe Biden's China strategy is not working. And so if anybody knows The Economist, you know it is a voice of the elite. It's a voice of the neocon foreign policy establishment. So on August 9th, President Joe Biden unveiled his latest weapon in America's economic war with China. So new rules to police investments made abroad by the private sector, and those into the most sensitive technologies in China will be banned. For decades, America cheered globalization of trade and capital, which brought vast benefits in terms of enhanced efficiency and lower costs for consumers. But in a dangerous world, efficiency alone is no longer enough. In America and across the West, China's rise is bringing other aims to the fore. Understandably, officials want to protect national security by limiting China's access to cutting-edge technology, which could enhance its military might, and to build alternative supply chains in areas where China maintains a vice-like grip. So there you have it. I mean, that's the admission that this is an economic war, that globalization, investing with China, cooperating with China is by far secondary to containing China and ensuring that China just can't learn from what the United States maybe has been able to accomplish. There's, of course, a truth that is being left out here, which is that China has actually advanced. And that's what they mean by vice-like grip on certain industries. It's that China has actually been kicking the U.S.'s can in a lot of these areas for several years now. So the result is a sprawl of tariffs, investment reviews, and export controls aimed at China, first under the previous president, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. Janet Yellen, America's Treasury Secretary, traveled to Delhi and Hanoi, India and Vietnam, to tout the benefits of friendshoring, signaling to company bosses that shifting away from China would be wise. Although such de-risking measures would lower efficiency, the thinking goes, sticking to sensitive products would limit the damage, and the extra cost would be worth it because America would be safer. So it would be worth it. The Madeleine Albright, Iraqis dead, 500,000 dead. It's worth it. And for people in the United States, this is the interesting thing, is that oftentimes China gets blamed for the poor working conditions that have transpired in the United States, the declining living standards, and that globalization is a big part of that. That is true in part. But what actually is true is that employers decided to just send, of course, these corporations sent their production lines to their supply chains and their production lines to the global south for much lower labor costs and, of course, much better tax benefits. And they decided to reap super profits from that. And at the same time, while eliminating a lot of jobs, continuing to pay Americans, very working class people in the U.S., very low in order to ensure that the competition between U.S. workers and the global south was in fact a race to the bottom rather than an attempt to actually increase the standard of living in the United States. Globalization was never meant to do that. And it was not China's fault. It was that the U.S. used its opportunity to cooperate with China at the working class in the U.S.'s expense. China had nothing to do with that. There was no reason for U.S. corporations to do this if they had any other interest but super profits. But of course, they didn't. And China was just one country where U.S. corporations eventually decided to invest. So the consequences of the thinking are becoming clear. Unfortunately, it is bringing neither resilience nor security. Supply chains have become more tangled and opaque as they have adapted to new rules. And if you look closely, it becomes clear that America's reliance on Chinese critical input remains. More worrying, the policy has had a perverse effect on pushing America's allies closer to China. This may come as a surprise because at first glance, the new policies look like a smashing success. Direct economic links between China and America are shriveling. In 2018, 2/3 of American imports from a group of low-cost Asian countries came from China. Last year, over half did. Instead, America has turned towards India, Mexico, and Southeast Asia. Investment flows are adjusting too. Chinese firms invested a staggering $48 billion in America 6 years on. The figure has shrunk to $3 billion. For the first time in a quarter century, China is no longer one of the top 3 investment destinations for most members of the American Chamber of Commerce in China. For the best part of 2 decades, China claimed the lion's share of new foreign investment projects in Asia. Last year, it received less than India and Vietnam. But you dig deeper and you find America's reliance on China remains intact. So this is a different argument. This is a warning that there needs to be more decoupling, right? And so that shouldn't come as a huge shock, right? It shouldn't come as a huge shock that the U.S., that the economists and that the neocons are pushing for more decoupling. Production, so America may be redirecting its demand from China to other countries, but production in those places now rely more on Chinese inputs than ever. As Southeast Asia's exports to America have risen, for instance, its imports of intermediate inputs from China have exploded. China's exports of car parts to Mexico, another country that has benefited from America de-risking, have doubled over the past 5 years. Research published by the IMF finds that even in advanced manufacturing sectors where America is keenest to shift away from China, the countries that have made most inroads into the American market are those with closest industrial links to China. Supply chains have become more complex and trade has become more expensive, but China's dominance is undiminished. What's going on? In the egregious cases, Chinese goods are simply repackaged and sent to third countries to America. At the end of 2022, America's Department of Commerce found that 4 major solar suppliers based in Southeast Asia were doing minor processing of otherwise Chinese products that they were in effect circumventing tariffs on Chinese goods. In other areas, such as rare earth metals, China continues to provide inputs that are hard to replace. So what this is really saying, and I don't need to go into the rest because all this is saying is more de-risking, more decoupling, is, and it's an untold secret, is that the more that the United States decides to decouple from China through economic war, China embraces the rest of the world. The rest of the world says, wow, this is a good deal to help us build up our manufacturing capacity, our production capacities, increase our ability to export goods and to get a real return on investment and to grow economically. And then those countries trade with the United States. So what the Economist is saying is, Joe Biden, this is not working. Your investment bans are not good enough. All right. So that should tell you the mindset of the neocon foreign policy establishment. They're making it out to be that somehow this is not consequential enough. And so this economic war, I mean, it's dangerous because as you've seen with what's happened with Russia and the destabilization of the world economy based on these sanctions as being a big part of this destabilization, the same is happening with China. These economic tariffs, the trade war, the sanctions on tech, all of it is actually having a negative impact. And so China has warned, and there are many different warnings coming from Chinese English language media. And I'm going to show you a couple to conclude the segment. So Chinese English language media is warning that Washington cannot afford a tech divorce from China. So this is what's so interesting, is that the US thinks that it can just restrict trade and tech cooperation, that somehow the global economy is just so fluid and so able to absorb those shocks. But the truth is the opposite. The truth is that every country has its own set of resources, its own market share, its own advantages, its own disadvantages, its own competitive advantages and not so competitive disadvantages. And that is what informs how countries cooperate together. You're not going to trade the same thing for the same thing, right? So what this is doing is it is destabilizing the so-called global supply chains, and that leads to many risks. And so China has told Joe Biden through its English language media that this restriction list is not popular with U.S. tech and financial companies who are already voicing their concerns. So the decision, right? So of course you have this ban, and China is calling it protectionist. It's a protectionist move that could risk backsliding on hard-won progress made through high-level exchanges to thaw relations over the past 3 weeks, or past few weeks. While that might be a price Washington is willing to pay to deter China's tech advancement, such an order and previous tech bans against Beijing could damage U.S.-China tech ties based on unfounded national security grounds. Washington wants it both ways. Through broader tech curbs, it intends to freeze Chinese technology and short-circuit Beijing's semiconductor ambitions. Meanwhile, its companies can still profit from the Chinese market. However, curb is a curb, and Washington's ever-growing restriction list is hardly popular among American business. U.S. tech and financial companies are voicing their concerns, fearing such curbs could send a chilling effect on cross-border investment in China. Microchip giants have been lobbying to curtail limitations to their operations in China for months, pressing the government to exercise restraint and weigh the curbs' impact at a recent White House meeting. The CEOs of 3 homegrown chip conglomerates, NVIDIA, Qualcomm, and Intel, have been cautioning against heavy-handedness on the U.S.'s most sweeping export controls yet, said Bloomberg. China also voiced its opposition shortly after the ban was rolled out. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said the United States restricted outbound investments from its companies, pushing decoupling in the investment sector under the guise of de-risking, a complete departure from the principles of the market economy and fair competition that the United States has long championed. The Biden administration should know that stifling China will not help America run faster. The White House has been working to rejuvenate America's own chip-making industries and expand its tech edge. Unfortunately, it's not working as intended. American industrial nationalists dream of reshoring and rebranding their domestic chip sector. Good luck. So this is how direct they're becoming. This is how direct China is becoming, saying good luck. Many chip makers are looking outside of America for options. Intel Capital has on record hinted at more investments overseas than U.S. soil, saying the world has changed significantly and the hub of global tech innovation is no longer limited to Silicon Valley. Chances are more firms may follow Intel's steps away from Biden's longer-term goals of encouraging more chip manufacturing on U.S. soil, business insiders say. Even if the White House can't expand American chip-making manufacturing capacities, the long rap sheet of chip export bans on China would render those efforts meaningless. Many of America's chip-making firms view China as their biggest market. Statistics show China accounts for around 30% of sales at Applied Materials, a quarter of Intel, 20% of NVIDIA, and 60% of sales at Qualcomm. Without orders from Chinese customers, there will be much less need to go ahead with projects such as Intel's planned factory complex in Ohio. Intel CEO Pat Gelsinger reportedly told U.S. officials. The latest ban would give a fresh jolt to the global supply and industrial chains and risk further fragmenting the global economy. Additionally, it could harm America's economy. In recent years, the U.S. has courted its allies to quash China's tech advances and block Chinese tech cooperation with overseas partners. But shorting China will be costly. According to an internal company document obtained by the German news service Der Spiegel, it would cost the state-owned rail operator Deutsche Bahn up to 400 million euros if it had to replace all components supplied by Chinese telecom giant Huawei across its network. The IMF says the long-term cost of trade fragmentation alone could range from 0.2% of global output in a limited fragmentation scenario to almost 7% in a severe one. Another reason Washington's tech war against China will fail is China's unwavering determination to excel in high-tech development. With one hand, the U.S. government is blocking China's progress on AI and supercomputing, but on the other, it is ushering Chinese companies towards concentrating their efforts on chips for products of daily use. And in a world in which Chinese companies dominate production on mature chips, driven directly by American policy, hardly looks like a victorious outcome for the U.S. This was the New York Times. In today's world of hyper interdependence, it is impossible for the world's top 2 economies, which enjoy significant economic complementarity, to decouple from each other. So that's the warning. The warning is decoupling is not going to go well for the United States. That these corporations enjoy a significant return on investment through the Chinese market, and that there are significant costs. And this is one thing that is often not talked about when it comes to this economic war. And this is true with Russia too. But I think because China is such a manufacturing hub, and it now is a high-tech manufacturing hub, what ends up happening is that the reality of the economic landscape, which says China can produce things cheaper, it can produce things faster, that if you give that up and instead go to the U.S. side, you're going to get a slower return on investment that is more costly. And that is what has happened with Europe and Russia, with Europe sanctioning Russia's energy and then replacing it with U.S. crude. The prices have gone up, and of course, the entire economy has not recovered in Europe. The U.S. corporations sell oil at exorbitant prices. And the same goes with tech. The investment is just much more costly. That is the reality, and it's going to affect the entire world economy, and indeed already has. And for however much China is slowed down by this process, it will not be slowed down to the point of no return. China is able to redirect its economy to be able to finish this process of self-reliance in the area of tech. It won't come as quickly, maybe, as China may hope. It takes time. There's patience that is needed. And indeed, the consequences of, for example, sanctions on Huawei have had consequences for China. When I was there, I was told that the Mate 15, the new Huawei phone, didn't have 5G technology because of the export ban on semiconductors, that Huawei wasn't able to get the sufficient number to put them in this new phone. And it looks like that is actually going to change, according to Reuters. I think Reuters published a week after I came back on the 11th of July. I think several days later, Reuters reported that actually now Huawei is starting to get things together. So that is the example, right? Huawei didn't have it, had to sell a phone with 4G technology behind progress of its other models, and then at the same time was able to hunker down and figure out how to do it itself so that it can produce 5G technology in its new phones. So China is not the problem here. It's not a ticking time bomb, right? China's economic growth is in fact real. It is on the road to recovery. Most economies worldwide have been in some form of stagnation or recession because it's a global economic slowdown. But China has certain advantages that the U.S. doesn't have. And one of the big advantages that the economists admitted is the fact that, let's be honest here, China is not isolated. China is not isolated. China is able to increase trade, South-South cooperation with countries in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia. The biggest trade deal does not reside among the Western countries, the collective West. It is the free trade agreement among the mainly Asian countries that make up the biggest free trade agreement in the world. So that is the reality, okay? That there is a new day here. China is being targeted more and more for economic warfare because it is actually succeeding. And its success in the tech sector is just one of the many quote unquote threats, the legitimate, I think, areas of concern for a hegemon, the United States, which sees any kind of progress by any sovereign country as the potential undoing of its rule around the world. And indeed, that's what is happening. And so just a couple of more things I'm just going to show you to underscore this point. So if you think war is going to happen against China anytime soon, well, China is getting prepared. A weapons breakthrough has been made in which it may be possible for Beijing to develop high-energy laser weapons that can shoot as long as their operators desire without any interruption in degradation and performance. And this is being researched by scientists at the National University of Defense Technology in Changsha, China, published the results of their research this month in Acta Optica Sinica, a peer-reviewed Chinese journal. They claim to have developed a new cooling system that makes it possible to operate high-energy lasers indefinitely without effects from overheating. It's a huge breakthrough in improving performance of high-energy laser systems. High-quality beams can be produced not only in the first second, but also maintained indefinitely. So if you think there's going to be a hot war based on this this tech war, this economic war the United States is waging, if you think it's going to slow down China's ability to defend itself, well, we have another thing coming. And then economically, it's not just that China is not isolated, but also it's that China is de-dollarizing, all right? China is diversifying gold, currency reserves, other currency reserves as the dollar becomes more risky. So China has continued its steady march toward de-dollarizing its economy, revealing on Monday that July has been the 9th straight month of gold purchases and that its foreign currency reserves are even higher than Western experts predicted. The People's Bank of China, the socialist state's central bank, said that last month it has purchased 23 tons or 740,000 troy ounces of gold bullion. That brings its total stockpile to its highest ever weight of 2,137 tons. Roughly 188 tons has been added amid a shopping spree that began last November. In addition, the People's Bank of China said that China's foreign currency reserves rose by 11.3 billion in July, racing to 3.02 trillion, higher than Western experts believed. So Chris Devonshire Ellis, chairman of Dezen Shira and Associates, who has a 30-year investment in business career in China, Russia, and Asia, told Sputnik on Wednesday that China was motivated primarily by economic stability, which the politicization of U.S. national debt has threatened. There are a couple of issues with this. They can't reduce their U.S. debt holdings by significant amounts at any one time, as this would depress the remaining values and upset the U.S. dollar trade balance, but they can do it gradually. It appears to be a long-term strategy and could take a couple of decades to convert their U.S. debt into other commodities under normal conditions, and that assumes that things are normal. But, you know, this is turbulent times. And, of course, the U.S. has actually been the one downgraded by Moody's from AAA to AA plus status of credit risk rating. So China is preparing, right? China is preparing for the end of U.S. hegemony because the end of U.S. hegemony is coming. This tech war is essentially, and this economic war is essentially about the decline of the United States as a hegemon and its shrinking share of the overall global economy. And it is trying to arrest that process by any means necessary. It won't work. It is not going to work. But at the same time, you have someone like Joe Biden, you have the neocon foreign policy establishment willing to push economic warfare no matter the costs and no matter the warnings that are being sounded by both the collective West itself, which is warning that more needs to be done if it's going to be effective, and China, of course, which is saying, be careful what you wish for, be careful what you do, because you might not like it. You might end up actually eating a Satan sandwich. Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.